Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Vous êtes les bienvenus au Forum international conjoint intitulé « L'avenir appartient à l'Afrique. Concevoir la voie de l'avenir, nouvelles frontières de l'éducation », organisé par la Bibliothèque Alexandrina et l'Université Sengor Alexandrie, en partenariat avec la Chambre de commerce et d'industrie française en Égypte et le Conseil égyptien des entreprises pour la coopération internationale et avec le soutien de l'Agence universitaire de la francophonie, du Consulat de France à Alexandrie et de l'Association des universités africaines. À noter que cette conférence arrive en phase de clôture après 2 journées entreprises qui se sont tenues du 18 au 19 décembre dans les locaux de l'université Sengor.
La conférence traite d'un sujet très important pour les jeunes Africains aujourd'hui, à savoir leur intégration professionnelle, les mutations socio-économiques et remodelage du marché du travail et la réduction de la fracture entre l'université et le monde de l'emploi, des sujets d'actualité assez importants. J'aimerais saluer nos chers conférenciers éminents et distingués d'institutions prestigieuses dans les domaines de l'enseignement supérieur, de l'emploi, les bibliothèques, les institutions de formation professionnelle et les universités qui nous rejoignent aujourd'hui de l'Égypte et de différents pays du monde. Nous vous remercions pour avoir accepté notre invitation marquée par votre présence.
Et maintenant, nous commençons par la session inaugurale par une allocution de Madame Dina Youssef, chef du secteur des bibliothèques de la Bibliothèque Alexandrina. Il faut mentionner que la Bibliothèque Alexandrina est représentée par la section de coopération internationale gérée par Madame Rania Shahraoui et la section des diplômes et des programmes professionnels gérée par Madame Sarah Gabaraoui, affiliée au département des institutions d'information et de compétences professionnelles gérée par Madame Rania Osman. Madame Dina Youssef, je vous laisse la parole.
Bonjour. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Dr. Ahmed Zayed, Director of the Bibliothèque Alexandrina, I'm honored to welcome you all to today's conference, The Future Belongs to Africa. Our distinguished guests, welcome you all. And we are keen here at the Bibliothèque Alexandrina to raise awareness on all emerging issues that are significant and of significant importance to our society. And today's topic is one of the very important topics that is important for that is an important focus that shapes the future of our beloved continent, Africa. We are facing a vast change of technologies and also changes in the needs of the society and also changes in the requirements of the jobs. All these focuses need adaptive changes in education and also in economic strategies and jobs and so on. Today, our eminent speakers will take us through a future journey for Africa. They will highlight new trends in education, new trending jobs, and challenges and opportunities that face our beloved continent, Africa. I hope this gathering will be a chance for you to benefit with the ideas discussed and for us to join forces to help develop our continent and drive Africa towards a prosperous future. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed this event, and hope to see you in all our future events at the Library of Alexandria. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Dina Youssef. Une deuxième allocution sera dite par professeur Thierry Vedel, recteur de l'Université Sengor à Alexandrie. Je tiens à souligner que notre conférence s'inscrit dans le cadre d'une coopération fructueuse entre la Biblioteca Alessandrina et l'Université Sengor, qui se veut d'être l'un des partenaires stratégiques de la BA, est représentée aujourd'hui par Monsieur le recteur et Madame Rania El Gendi, directrice des relations extérieures, et son équipe. Professeur Thierry, la parole est à vous.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je voudrais juste prévenir la régie que je vais faire une petite présentation. En tout cas, je voudrais vous souhaiter la bienvenue dans cette manifestation, remercier la Biblioteca pour tous les efforts qui ont été faits ces dernières semaines avec l'aide de Rania pour organiser cet événement, remercier nos partenaires qui se sont associés à ces journées, les entreprises aussi qui ont participé aux journées entreprises hier. Et si vous me le permettez, pour ceux qui ne la connaissent pas encore, je voudrais dire quelques mots à propos de l'Université Sengor. Je projette à l'écran des diapositives en anglais, mais je vais parler en français si vous me le permettez. Et je vais être assez bref. Le thème du colloque, c'est « L'avenir appartient à l'Afrique ». Et je crois que l'Université Sengor a son rôle à jouer dans ce fait que, en tout cas, sa mission, c'est de contribuer à ce que l'avenir appartienne à l'Afrique également. Donc nous sommes une université internationale de langue française au service du développement africain et avec un statut qu'on appelle opérateur direct de la francophonie. Ça veut dire que nous appartenons à un réseau institutionnel composé de plusieurs acteurs, le premier d'entre eux étant l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie, et un autre acteur que vous connaissez bien ici en Égypte, c'est l'Agence universitaire de la francophonie également. Alors notre mission, c'est de former en français des cadres créatifs pour le développement africain qui sont capables de relever les défis du développement durable de l'Afrique. Et notre vision, c'est de devenir un acteur majeur de la formation des cadres, majeur non pas en nombre, mais majeur en excellence et en innovation. Alors à Alexandrie, en quelques mots, depuis 1990 que nous existons, nous organisons 9 programmes de master pour environ 200 étudiants qui proviennent d'un concours auquel participent environ 4000 candidats. Donc nous avons un processus de sélection très fort, processus très sélectif. Et nos étudiants, la plupart d'entre eux sont ici, proviennent de 25 pays d'Afrique et d'Haïti également. Ils doivent avoir eu au moins 1 an d'expérience professionnelle avant de venir, donc ce sont de jeunes professionnels. Ils sont pris en charge pour une grande partie d'entre eux entièrement pendant leurs 2 années de séjour ici. Et nous avons mis en place une politique genre pour favoriser la place des femmes dans notre public. Et pour opérer ces 9 programmes de master, nous mobilisons des experts et des professeurs de tous les continents, d'Europe, d'Amérique du Nord, d'Afrique, au nombre d'environ 150 chaque année. Alors nous avons également développé une politique d'externalisation, ça veut dire que maintenant nous sommes présents aussi en dehors de l'Égypte, sur l'ensemble du continent africain. Vous voyez ici les pays où nous sommes présents en orange. En jaune, ce sont les pays avec lesquels on discute dans la perspective d'ouvrir un nouveau campus, et notamment les prochains campus vont ouvrir en Tunisie et au Vietnam en 2023. Dans ces campus, nous offrons des programmes de master également, une vingtaine, pour des gens en activité professionnelle. Et nous les délivrons en partenariat avec des institutions nationales. On y accueille environ 350 étudiants par an. On mobilise environ 200 professeurs et experts du monde entier. Et nous avons aussi des programmes plus courts qui sont proposés dans les pays d'intervention. Alors, nous sommes une institution qui bénéficie d'un certain nombre de subventions de certains États, et en particulier de la France, du Canada, de la Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles, de la Suisse, du Québec et de l'Égypte également, qui, en plus de nous offrir notre siège et bientôt notre nouveau campus, je vous en montrerai une image, accompagne aussi un petit peu financièrement l'université. Alors, nous sommes également une organisation apprenante et effectivement, nous essayons de nous adapter aux challenges de l'évolution du monde et en particulier de l'évolution du secteur éducatif, de l'enseignement supérieur, pour répondre aux besoins de capacité, de formation des cadres en particulier. Donc, nous avons mené à l'université ces dernières années 3 grandes transformations: une transformation pédagogique, une transformation managériale, une transformation digitale. Nous avons développé notamment le statut entrepreneurial de l'université qui aujourd'hui anime, conçoit, pilote, anime un certain nombre de projets qui bénéficient de financement d'organisations externes. Nous avons mis en place une politique genre, nous développons la culture entrepreneuriale de nos étudiants, nous nous sommes développés récemment en Afrique centrale, nous avons créé récemment une école doctorale et nous aurons bientôt un nouveau campus capable d'accueillir 2 fois plus d'étudiants. Alors nous agissons principalement dans 4 grands domaines, mais la plupart de nos programmes de formation sont des programmes de gestion de projet, de management de projet, dans le champ de la culture, dans le champ de l'environnement, dans le champ de la santé. Et puis notre département management, il a une vocation un peu plus transversale autour justement des techniques de management. Nous avons aussi développé plus récemment des activités de formation dans le domaine de la gestion des crises, des risques et des crises, dans le domaine de l'économie bleue, c'est l'économie qui tourne autour de la mer, et dans le domaine de la mobilité urbaine, bien sûr, tournée vers les problèmes africains. Juste un petit mot pour dire à quel point nous essayons d'évoluer et d'adapter nos formations. Nous avons transformé nos maquettes pour mettre l'accent sur l'employabilité de nos étudiants, le renforcement de l'employabilité de nos étudiants, en développant un certain nombre de pratiques pédagogiques et en mettant l'accent sur la dimension interdisciplinaire. Donc vous voyez ici en proportion de l'ensemble des cours, la part qui est consacrée au développement des soft skills, des capacités transversales, des compétences transversales en jaune, en bleu clair les cours interdisciplinaires, en bleu foncé toutes les activités de projet et de stage. L'ensemble, vous voyez, représente une bonne partie du programme de formation. Bien sûr, nous travaillons en partenariat avec énormément d'institutions en Afrique, en Europe et en Amérique du Nord également. Nous avons quelques anciens qui ont fait des parcours remarquables. La première en haut à gauche, notamment, est une personne que vous connaissez peut-être. Elle est égyptienne, elle est diplômée de l'université Sengor et elle est commissaire à l'Union africaine, commissaire à l'énergie et aux infrastructures. Nous avons plusieurs ministres en activité, des directeurs d'agences nationales, beaucoup d'anciens dans le réseau des Nations Unies ou dans les banques de développement. Voici une image de notre futur campus. Dans 1 an peut-être, il sera comme ça. Voici son état aujourd'hui. Donc vous voyez que le chantier avance. Et nous serons donc prochainement à Borg El Arab, juste à côté de l'université égypto-japonaise. Pour terminer, je voudrais juste vous montrer une petite vidéo qui vous donnera un petit peu une idée de l'esprit Sengor qui règne, disons, à l'université Sengor.
La bouche.
Était notre lieu d'intérêt.
Patricia, es-tu prête?
Oui. Et toi, Léa?
Oh, je suis très prête. À la guerre, à la guerre, à la guerre.
C'était 2 années de la promotion précédente qui, comme vous le savez, a connu la période Covid qui a été particulièrement difficile. Merci beaucoup, je vous souhaite une excellente journée à toutes et à tous et je remercie encore nos invités qui vont partager avec nous leurs réflexions sur l'Afrique de demain. Merci.
Merci beaucoup à vous, professeur Thierry Vedel, recteur de l'Université Sengor à Alessandrie, pour votre allocution. Et maintenant, le mot de notre conférencier principal, professeur Bakri Osman Saïd, président de l'Association des universités africaines. Il va parler de l'éducation d'aujourd'hui pour l'emploi de demain, les tendances réformatrices dans l'enseignement supérieur. Professeur Bakri est aussi président de l'Université internationale du Soudan et titulaire de la chaire UNESCO en éducation à la santé scolaire au Soudan. Il est actuellement président de la Chambre nationale pour la santé, l'éducation et la formation de l'Union soudanaise des chambres de commerce. L'homme est depuis longtemps un défenseur de la protection de l'environnement et de la sécurité alimentaire et membre du Conseil national de biosécurité au Soudan et le président de sa comité technique. De sa comité technique. Professeur Bakri, veuillez nous rejoindre s'il vous plaît, sous vos ovations.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm privileged and honored to be a speaker to this esteemed audience, and I'm grateful for the organizers of this important event. I would like to thank Ms. Dina Youssef, Professor Terry, and His Excellent Consul General of France in Alexandria. Higher education is facing big challenges globally. The most serious warnings are coming from the USA. It's not the first time which higher education found itself in the midst of a lot of problems, but it's probably different this time. And the main challenges facing higher education in the USA, first, is very significant drop in enrollment rates. About 13% in the last 10 years, and they are expecting that there will be additional 15% drop around 2025. This is linked to the very high cost of education in America, with an average debt on a student of $37,000 US. Again, there are problems with tenure. Most of the staff is adjunct or part-time. Politicians, both Republicans and Democrats, declare frequently that they are not satisfied with the status of higher education in America, and most importantly, the emergence of alternatives, because many young people now realize that they only need a narrow range of set of skills, which they can learn in few months' time, spending $10,000 to $15,000 US, instead of spending 4 years at college and ending up with this burden of debt. The problems we face in Africa here are different. And a number of experts in higher education were asked about what are the problems of higher education in Africa. I will read some of these answers without referring to the persons. Poor and access and equity, inadequate quality and relevance, insufficient research and knowledge transfer, the need to overcome political rivalries, delivery of quality education and linking education with socio-economic development through emphasis on science, technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Access to higher education for the relevant age group remains very low. Women are underrepresented, especially in science and technology. The contradiction of unemployed graduates and a lack of skilled workforce, because the current pattern of skills production in African universities does not quite match labor market demands or development needs. Lack of investment, no critical mass of quality faculty, insufficient sustainable financing, shortcomings in governance and leadership, inadequate regional specialization of the higher education systems, low salary of faculties, lack of research funding and equipment, limited autonomy, provide disincentives for professors to stay in African universities, academic disruption due to strikes, and etc. A question which has been asked before: does higher education affect productivity, growth, and thus the economy? The World Bank earlier on encouraged governments to concentrate on general education. Later, there was a change of mind of the World Bank. And now, it is well established that higher education is important for development. But what sort of higher education? Many studies, including a very recent detailed paper from China, demonstrated that expansion in higher education is associated with economic growth. However, such association was not universal. We haven't seen it in Africa with massification of higher education. And there are a number of publications which studied this. And the reason is supposed to be the low quality of higher education offered by most African universities. The experience of developing countries in some developing countries in Asia and Latin America is shown that the speed and extent to which developing countries are able to utilize and modify technology developed mainly in the high-income countries will determine whether they will be able to realize a more rapid transition to higher levels of development and standards of living for their citizens. In this way, some developing countries and emerging economies have speeded the pace of development by investing in higher education. However, the study of those experiences proved that there is no one-size-fits-all model of development. And it's interesting to note that those countries achieved this development while their higher education remained lagging significantly behind Western countries in basic research and generation of innovative ideas. And this is why it is important to remember the stage of development of a country, which will help us use the limited resources we have. While broadly speaking, the body of literature on higher education and economic development has grown considerably over the years, there's still need for more research in this area. For instance, little work has been done which focuses on the characteristics and dynamics of the relationship between higher education and development, or on the contextual and institutional factors which facilitate or inhibit these relationships. Neither has there been much research within the African context, nor does that take both national and institutional factors into account. The emergence of knowledge economy puts new burden on governments and universities because it brings the need for producing new human capital with relevant skills, knowledge, and attitude to help governments compete in the global marketplace. So has the response of African universities been adequate for that particular purpose? We'll try to answer this question as we go through this presentation. In a knowledge-based economy, workers need to cultivate specialized skill, and they must be creative, work in teams, and adapt to rapidly evolving technologies and innovations. Ever since the transition from feudalism to capitalism, the basic source of productivity, value, and economic growth has been physical labor and manual skill. In the knowledge-intensive organization, intelligence and intellectual labor replace this physical labor as the fundamental source of value and profit. The need to train a creative and innovative workforce is not just limited to low or middle income countries. Even in developed countries, there's a lot of worry now among workers about job security. Approximately 47% of jobs in the United States could be at risk due to exponential advances in computer control equipment, sensory tools, algorithmic sophistication, and processing power. The resultant abilities of computers to perform non-routine cognitive tasks that were once considered unassailable, such as legal writing, medical diagnosis, law enforcement, and vehicle navigation, consequently threaten to displace workers who are not able to otherwise secure employment. How to revitalize higher education in Africa? Now, as the African countries or many African economies start to recover now after the COVID-19 catastrophes, coupled with the recent recognition of the World Bank and other development agencies of the importance of higher education can play in the socio-economic development process in Africa, and a resurgence of interest in African higher education, it becomes imperative to accelerate the recovery and revitalize higher education institutions across the continent. Initiatives such as the Africa Centers of Excellence and others are important. The Africa Centers of Excellence is a program funded by the World Bank in association with 12 countries in Central and Western Africa. It's coordinated by the Association of African Universities. It's a 4-year term. We are in the second term now, and it has some requirements like a research group which wins the grant, which is about $6 to $8 million over 4 years. They have to have a link with a developed research group in America or in Europe, and they have to train a number of PhDs from the region. And so these requirements, I don't want to go into detail, but I was on the evaluation panel of the World Bank, and my conclusion was that such setup really produce a level of doctoral education which we don't see in most African universities. So that's probably a model. International linkage is important, and funding is important, and focus on specific missions, and focus on relevant research questions. So tertiary education is essential driver of economic and social development in all African nations. That now is agreed upon fact. And then the skilled human capital and strong research base are key elements of a country's economic growth strategy, but they also determine its capacity to attain the sustainable development goals. The prediction now, most African countries are not going to attain the SDG goals by 2030. And higher education has got a big task of helping their societies to do better. I will now discuss a few topics which are relevant to production of human capital and the functioning of higher education. The first one is distance learning. Interest in distance learning has been with us for about a quarter of a century in MOOCs and otherwise. But really, it accelerated during COVID time. So in crisis, as they say, there is always an opportunity. So COVID actually, crisis compelled many universities, which are very reluctant to take up online education. And so they start doing that. And I don't think we are going back. We probably live with a hybrid form of learning. But to do it properly, universities have to invest in infrastructure, and they need to retrain their academic staff. Distance learning is not just a poor alternative to physical learning in class. It is true that distance learning has to compete with the strength and the presence of in-person in the class. But again, distance learning is just not putting a lecture on a platform. It's a lot more than that. It has merits of flexible schedules, of scaling. Distinguished professors will be available to tens of thousands of people. It has merits of extending reach of institution and academics, with probably some financial gain as well. And it's a very powerful tool for mid and lifelong learning, which is really essential in the knowledge economy. But more than that, because the market for distance learning is now expanding, I hope this will interest big companies, big tech companies, to invest and research in this area and really create a form of distance learning which is not inferior to in-person learning. An extension to that is what a new form of education, what we call micro-credentials. Micro-credentials means small units of teaching between degrees and courses. We had them before in the form of certificates, of licenses, CPD, continuous professional development, and all that. But what is new is that there is a movement now to integrate them into the landscape of the ecosystem of higher education and to accredit these courses and subject them to quality assurance principles. UNESCO has recently this year published a 28-page report called Towards a Common Definition of Micro-Credentials, in which it stated the merits and benefits of micro-credentials and some of the reservations, because we don't want micro-credentials to be like a fast food, the McDonald's of higher education, and to actually suck funding from traditional. And so there are still a lot of questions which need to be answered before these micro-credentials become main form of education. The other topic I would like to touch is research universities. Universities in Africa started usually as a single university established by the colonial powers in the run-up to independence or shortly before, after independence. And education remained very elitist in a number of years before post-colonial administrations started expanding on higher education. And then we went into the age of massification of higher education throughout the continent. Then people were asking themselves, it is the best way higher education can serve development. As I said, in developing countries, there is no research evidence that just educating more people is going to have positive influence of development. People need to look into the system in more details. And there is now almost a consensus, or semi, among experts that Africa needs research universities. By research universities is a definition, these are universities or academic institutions committed to creation and dissemination of knowledge. And they possess appropriate infrastructure, laboratories, libraries, etc., and the right level academic staff to support teaching and research at the highest possible level, like the elitist universities in the West. So their role will be to provide access to global science networks, produce basic and applied research, but they go beyond that. They have a role in education as well, educating leaders for academia and the society. Okay, so the first question I want to ask, aren't our universities today capable of doing this job? I will refer to two studies, both produced in South Africa. One, the Hirana study, which looked at the flagship universities from a number of sub-Saharan Africa, African countries. And the conclusion is that, generally speaking, universities, their studies are not really capable of new knowledge production. They made an exception for University of Cape Town in South Africa. But University of Cape Town is not an example of an average university. It receives a lot of international support from a lot of agencies. I know from the UK, Cape Town and another 2 universities in South Africa receive an aid of $50 million a year, and so on. There are other factors. And the other study was edited by my friend, Professor Damio Tefera. He's Ethiopian, but he's professor of higher education in the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa as well. It's more recent, looked at flagship universities in a number of African countries, including Egypt. And the conclusion was similar, although he praised flagship universities for being responsible for the meager contribution African universities make to global knowledge. So if we need research universities, but we don't have them, and we know that it's not easy because they're expensive to establish and to support, not only in Africa, but even in developed countries. And this is why even in developed countries, they try to forge links with industry, which help them in one way by making resources available, but there have been people criticizing this link as this link with industry limits the scope of research of these research universities and orient them towards more applied and research aimed at product. I don't mind this for Africa because I think for our stage of development, we need to be very careful about not spending our little resources we have on Star Wars sort of research projects. Research we do has to be relevant to the stage of development of African universities. Right, so there are usually few. In America, out of 3,000 universities, the research universities are 150. In Britain, there are about 20. China is aiming at having around 20. And so a country should have at least one university. It is not easy to do that because one of the prerequisites for having such research university is to have a differentiated higher education system which acknowledges and legitimizes that higher education institutions are variable in their structure, in their mission, in their funding mechanisms. And that is not always easy in our part of the world where this egalitarian culture dominates, where everybody wants to be at the same level as the other person. There are African universities who are aspire to become true research universities. And we don't want to have the Harvards or the Sorbonnes or the Oxfords or the West, but at least aim, say, at the second line of elitist Western universities. This tiered model exists in developed countries. In America, it exists, there are the community colleges, there are the multi-purpose state universities, there are the research universities. And the research universities receive more competitive government funding than the other universities. In Britain, the same thing, Oxford and Cambridge receive a lot more funding than other British universities. Even in Russia, they have this tier system. I saw it when I went to Moscow. I was moving from university to another, and when I go to another university, I feel as if I have moved into a completely different country in terms of the facilities available and the quality of research which is done in different universities. The other topic I want to touch on is the international ranking, because universities now are obsessed with ranking. Governments have used ranking for allocation of resources and so on. And ranking has been criticized, the credibility of the data itself, the subjective nature of the data, reputational surveys, universities manipulate data or cheat on data outright. Now, and then we end up looking at the top 100 or 500 universities. What is the percentage of this, the total number of universities? is extremely little. The overwhelming majority of universities are not going to get ranked anyway. But even the few who get ranked or rise in the league tables, they have to ask themselves, is it worth the resources they spend? Is it worth the disruption they make in their priorities? Because the most important priority of a university is teaching, is to educate these young people with sufficient knowledge and skill to enable them to obtain meaningful employment and a successful life. And when that takes a backseat, because most of these ranking mechanisms rank research, they don't rank teaching. And the ones which rank teaching, they do that by proxy measures, reputational surveys, or subjective measures, asking universities to fill in forms. It's very difficult to quantify teaching. However, I say that, and I know university ranking is not going to go away. It's going to be here. And universities are not going to ignore it. But it's extremely important for a university and a government to make sure that in their pursuance of ranking, they have to stick to the main mission and remember that they should concentrate on teaching and producing the new human capital needed for the new knowledge economy for them to have a chance in competing globally. The other issue I want to actually finish with is that we need to reform our higher education. And there are a number of topics, but I will probably limit myself to in the interest of time. One of them is governance of higher education. The way a university is managed and led is extremely important for it to fulfill its functions. African universities started at post-colonial time as I said, elitist universities with autonomy, usually controlled by scholars, and they have a lot of academic freedom. But later, governments start redefining the role of higher education, and rightly so, because they have to be accountable for the citizens' interests, for the taxpayers, because Africans looked up for higher education after independence to solve their problems of underdevelopment, problems of education, of services, of disease, poverty, infrastructure, and so on. And the effect of higher education on the lives of the individuals in Africa has been, to a great extent, marginal. So, however, the intervention of government has not always been positive, because quite often governments intervene for their own sake, because they either want to control the universities politically or they appoint their own cronies who might lack academic credibility in academic or administrative position and so on. But the universities cannot withdraw because it is their role to make sure that higher education works for the people. But even some African countries which tried election of the leadership of universities, they did not have really a positive outcome. And quite often there are tribal issues and what they call politicized ethnicities, populism over talent, and so on. So I think it is important to think about how can we achieve a governance scheme which puts the right people in the right place and which is, thank you, transparent enough. And I will finish by discussing a subject which is rarely talked about, corruption in higher education. Corruption in higher education is a global problem. If you look up the literature, you find a lot of examples. They all come from USA or Europe. Not because we don't have corruption, but we put a lid on it. We don't talk about it. Even worse, there are some forms of corruption which are practiced in higher education in Africa, which are not labeled so. So we really need to address this issue. Corruption in African universities occurs at all levels and is committed by all people. It's committed by academics, by administrators, by students, by the ministries of higher education, by the regulatory bodies, and so on. And it is undermining the function of universities in Africa. To graduate a doctor who is not fit for practice is a crime. To publish fraudulent research is a crime. To manipulate entry criteria for students is a big crime. So we need to have enough courage to address these issues. There are very few publications from Asia. Africa, very little. There's a recent publication by a very courageous Ethiopian researcher about corruption in higher education in Ethiopia. So I will summarize by saying that higher education in Africa is under pressure to change, to improve quality and relevance. Technology should be at the heart of this transformation. The new model of education delivery will probably continue to involve a blended online and in-person experience. There is need to increase focus on applied learning and employability of graduates. Micro-credentials will play a role here. China now has a higher education system which evolved over 70 years. And they have a group of research universities, and they are now spending huge amounts of money on these universities, and the gap actually is narrowing in the international ranking between these Chinese research universities and the elitist Western universities. The amount of money they spend, we don't have this option here in Africa. We just simply don't have that amount of money. I was reading some literature from China, and I looked at the financial reward which a Chinese researcher gets when he or she publishes a paper in a journal like Science or Nature. And I didn't believe the figure. It was just phenomenal. Then the rest of the education is going more vocational. And they have what they call the X+1 model, where a student gets a university qualification and another vocational qualification, which will promote or help facilitate employability. So there is need to focus on the applied learning and employability. Technological innovation is the means by which higher education can have a positive effect on economic growth. Good governance, transformational leadership, and curbing corruption are essential for innovative improvement of the institution's productivity, efficiency, and effectiveness. Thank you for listening.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Bakri, pour votre excellente intervention. Et maintenant, nous vous invitons tous pour une photo collective sur les escaliers devant le petit théâtre, et après, on se dirigera vers la salle à usage multiple au deuxième étage dans le même bâtiment pour l'ouverture de l'exposition des entreprises. Le retour à la salle ici, ça sera à 12h exactement. Soyez à l'heure ici. D'accord? Merci. Nous vous attendons maintenant à l'extérieur.